Hello and welcome to the 1916 Company Podcast. I'm Tim Masso here with Armand Johnston. Today we are discussing our favorite brands. We're building small monobrand collections, at least 5 each unless we wind up with more time and more ideas, but we're going to go back and forth talking about how we would build out a monobrand collection with 5 slots available. So Armand, why don't you go first? Tell us which brand you chose, why you chose it, and then give us your first pick and tell us about it.
Well, I went with my first love in a watch brand, and that is Omega. I tried to picture a brand that I could pull, that pulls on my heartstrings, that I could pull a couple vintage pieces from, that I could pull a true, well-rounded collection on. And I'll let everybody be the judge in whether or not I did that. My first pick is a vintage pick. Actually, my 2 first picks are vintage picks. But I wanted to start off with a 70s marine chronometer. This is a 1500 megaquartz caliber. It's a funky case. It is different. It is square. And there's something to be said about the marine chronometry aspect of it. You know, I've seen this on the wrist of Jacques Cousteau. I've seen it on various groups of people in different types of environments, both on the ocean and not. But I actually had a question for you on this. Is this part of the Constellation series due to the accuracy, due to the marine chronometry connection? Why is it a Constellation?
It is, but it isn't. It was part of the Constellation line on an electronic basis. That is to say, they built several different versions of these caliber, like 1510s, 1511s. These were very, very rare pieces put in flagship model lines. And so there were standalone marine chronometers, and then there were the Connies, which used the same basic calibers. Pardon me, these are calibers like 1516, 1511, and I think a caliber 1510 was used in one of the Connies with a sort of aventurine glass dial. And so those were part of the Constellation collection, but the marine chronometers, both large and small, were considered to be more seamasters and sort of standalones, if we're totally honest, because of the price of them and the positioning. They were considered to be the real deal back then. There was no GPS in the 70s, so they were considered to be marine chronometers that you could just wear. Now, a big difference is a lot of those marine chronometers explicitly labeled actually went through chronometer testing, whereas the movements that went into the Constellations, I believe, never formally went through chronometer testing, but they are in every other electronic and mechanical regard identical. So the reason it was in the Constellation collection was just that the Constellation from 1952 really through the 80s and the 90s was considered to be the flagship collection. The sports watches maybe are better known from today's perspective just because we're very sports watch centric, but if you asked anyone like what is the peak of the Omega collection from the 50s through the 90s, you're probably going to get some sort of answer along the lines of a Constellation. And unless we're talking about some of the specialties like tourbillon or skeleton watches that emerged in the 90s, the Connie was always positioned as the foremost offering. And it only kind of fell out of favor during the 90s because of the rise of interest in sports watches and the fact that the Constellation became a really big favorite out in East Asia. But it lost a lot of traction during that so-called Griffin Claw or Manhattan design era in the West and the United States.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the pricing of the marine chronometer because I did do a little digging into that. The original retail was $1,850, and in the 70s, that was, I guess, depending on what year, that was probably between $9,000 and $12,000.
Yeah, it was a very expensive watch, and it was designed to be more than a trophy. It was a large watch. It was a crazy-looking watch. It is a watch that still can be made to run well to this day. You're more likely to get good service, I think, from a specialist who knows electronic watches well than maybe sending it back to the factory. But they made them in large sizes, small sizes, chronometer certified and non-chronometer certified. And this is that whole 1510, 1511, 1516 range of movements. Very expensive, very exclusive, very prestigious at the time, priced far above any of the mechanical watches. And to this day, still a wonderful piece to own, though my goodness, do they eat their way through batteries.
I've heard that being one of the biggest woes. I mean, due to the due to the early quartz movement, no doubt. I adore the case shape. It's kind of a square bell, if that makes sense. And I love the serial number at the 6 o'clock flank. I think that's such a fun quirk.
Yeah, I believe that they made a couple of all steel models for the French market, I want to say, because I think there were hallmarking issues where, you'd pay some ridiculous tax on precious metal. But the watch overall, the fact that the default was steel and gold kind of speaks to what Omega perceived the prestige of this watch to be when it came out. And you got to remember, at the same time this was being made, Patek Philippe was making these large ornamental marine chronometer desk clocks that doctors and stockbrokers and partner level attorneys could use to grace their office as a totem of power. So this whole idea of the ultra accurate chronometer certified or chronometer level quartz movement was very en vogue in this period. It hadn't become yet, the watch you get in a Happy Meal.
We have one of those Patek desk chronometers on our website right now. It's awesome, actually.
You can hear it across the room. It is very impressive.
What is your first pick? What is your brand and first pick?
Okay, so when I was first getting into the watch space, there were a handful of brands that really represented, the haut de gamme and the top of the shelf to me. And Omega, Jaeger-LeCoultre, and Zenith, and it was basically just down to a flip of the coin in my Navy days that I decided as I began watch collecting, I would step into the world of Jaeger-LeCoultre, and I'd really planned out this entire Zenith roadmap that would take me through years and models and model lines and eras of the company. And again, just basically on a whim one day, I decided I'm going to go the JLC route, but I still have a lot of those Zeniths in my mind and my heart. And so the first one is related to the first Zenith I ever encountered. I encountered the Zenith Chronomaster XXT at the Walt Whitman Mall in the used case of a Torno, back when they still had Torno at mid-sized malls. And it wasn't something they sold. It was something that was traded in, I think, on a Rolex. And I was just about to join the Navy or put in my application to OCS. It was 2008, and the economy was already beginning to faceplant, and I knew that because I was in the finance space at the time, and the halls and the train stations and the rail cars in Lower Manhattan went dead silent one day, and it never picked up again. But the canary in the coal mine wasn't on my mind as I tried that watch on, and it was 45 millimeters in stainless steel, and probably at the limit of what I could wear with a straight face, and I really agonized back and forth over this before deciding I was actually okay with the size of it. But I thought you'd really have to be someone special and do something special to deserve that watch. Like, wow, what a trophy to give yourself for a life well lived or some sort of adversity overcome or a milestone. And so I had the money for it, but I just didn't feel like I deserved it. And I had this whole new chapter of my life opening up with the military coming up, and I'm like, I just can't make this commitment right now. And it stayed with me. And this was a Terry Nataf era Zenith that had an open dial where you could see the escapement and you could see the terminal end of the drivetrain. It had a power reserve indicator. It was, of course, an El Primero chrono. And it was the chronomaster case from the 90s that first came around in 1994, but it was a much, much bigger size of it. No longer 40 millimeters, it was 45 and probably, 54 millimeters lug to lug, but I put it on my wrist and it felt so right and it looked so right, and I always regretted not buying it, putting it in a box, and then asking my mom or my grandma or my dad to give it to me when I finally deserved it, like when I met that milestone. So this is going to be the first watch on my list because it's the one that drew me into the Zenith brand and actually had a big role in pulling me back into watches after my Navy days.
That sentiment of, oh gosh, I have to do something great to get this is something that I really love and is all but lost in our current industry. That sentiment of marking a milestone with a watch and working your way towards that milestone, all the while saving for that watch, despite being able to afford it, despite having the money in your account, despite it being a large or small purchase. That notion of I need to do something to deserve this watch is almost gone.
But, speaking from the perspective of someone in the first half of his 20s with his first job and a limited income, it felt to me like I hadn't quite reached that point in life.
Now, did the open work aspect of, or the partial open work aspect of this, did that pepper your decision on this? Did that, the inner workings kind of interest you a little bit more at that time than they do now? Is this kind of still a piece that you think about?
I think it's still cool. I think it was probably the one thing Taranatov got right that wasn't just an in-the-moment decision to make the watch bigger or more expensive or crazier. This was actually, I think, a real insight into why people buy mechanical watches, and understanding how compelling a case back can be, and then realizing that that's why a lot of people pay ridiculous money for tourbillon. This was sort of like 90% of the tourbillon excitement, but for... Yep, I can see you got that watch out on your computer. That's going to be the next one. We're not there yet.
Oh, man, but, the fact that there is this version that exists is exciting to me.
Yeah, we're going to get there. But, just finishing up on the XXT, I think having the escapement on the dial side obviates the need for a tourbillon, especially when it's the El Primero. And I knew even then that the El Primero was famous for being a high-rate watch. And I think being able to see it as well as hear it without taking it off the wrist, that was really cool. I still like that, and there's a reason it's still in the Zenith catalog. It just works. It's a good idea.
El Primero is exciting to watch for the high beat rate. I agree.
So what's up next after the Connie quartz chronometer grade aventurine dial vintage opus? How do you top that?
So I think my first two picks are my most interesting. I'll put it that way. I went for a dress pick this time, and this is tough because so many vintage Omegas can be brought into the realm of dressy, largely due to size, low complication. The watch that got me into watches was my grandfather's late 50s Constellation bumper automatic, so that was naturally low-hanging fruit. But
is that a pipe pan?
It is not, no.
But it's a bumper.
It is,
which is awesome.
And the first time I opened the case back, which is engraved, I was just blown away. Just love the watch. But I went with the Omega DeVille Central Tourbillon, and the original one that we actually discussed in one of our first episodes, the anniversary to the Omega caliber, the centralized tourbillon with the Omega symbol in the center. It is truly outrageous, and it's just an awesome dress piece that is, I use this phrase a lot, it's looking off center when a lot of people are looking center.
And I would even go so far as to say this. Back in 1994, that wasn't a tourbillon, that was the tourbillon. It was not just centralized, which made it unique, it was also a flying tourbillon. And you count on one finger the number of dial-side central flying tourbillon on the market back in 1994. This is a very rare watch. Only a few dozen were made with the original caliber, and you've got one if you shake it around a little bit. It sounds like it's ringing like a bell, because the rotor was built into the case back on the original version of this watch. And, it's another thing that made it very unusual. It was an automatic tourbillon. But because it's built into the case back instead of attached to the bridges of the movement, you get that ringing bell-like chime, and it's almost got a little bit of a Christmas bell type of jingle to it.
I feel like I've become, and this is a personal thing, I feel like I've become tourbillon jaded in weird ways, and this is one that still excites me. This is one that still, I don't know, it just gets the motor revving because it is different. It's not necessarily... It feels more part of the watch itself than an afterthought, if I could say, just due to the centralization, due to kind of the floating handset that, they make up the hour hand and minute hand.
Yeah, it is the seconds hand, so you've got hours, minutes, and seconds, so it makes sense on that basis. It's better integrated. If you look at what else was out there at the time, you look at the Gerald Genta tourbillons with caseback featuring, you couldn't see them from the dial side. You look at Audemars Piguet's off-centered tourbillon, fun, but at the same time, almost peripheral to the watch. Like, you look at the first automatic AP tourbillon from the 80s, and I'm not sure whether the tourbillon or the bumper is the most prominent feature of the dial. Whereas here, it's front and center, and it actually comes from a similar watchmaker, Maurice Grimm, who's linked to both those pieces, the AP and the Omega. The Omega was not just a more fully realized tourbillon automatic, it's a better watch mechanically. And again, you've got that company that'll be behind it forever. Whereas, we talk about being tourbillon jaded today, we're also novelty jaded and independent jaded. And I can tell you Omega will be around in 100 years to take care of that watch. Whereas a lot of these things, particularly the sub $10,000 tourbillon that seem to be everywhere now, I don't know who's going to take care of those or provide parts in even 10 years from now.
I think beyond the tourbillon, what's nice about this is that that's not the only thing that is interesting about the watch. You have a very modest 38 millimeter case, and the case is not an afterthought. The case is purposeful. The lugs are gorgeous. They're stepped. There's a step on the bezel itself. There's a generous amount of gold. I think the watch is a knockout through and through, and a perfect dress watch.
Yeah, really cool piece on every level. Nicely designed, not too big. I believe it's just under 39 millimeters. I think it's already like 38.7 or some weird thing like that. And it's hard to find tourbillon watches that are balanced, beautiful, historically significant, rare, nicely sized, nicely proportioned. And I really do think that you could go out and buy one of these. I don't know if you could find one of the first series. They're hard to pick up. Not bad. I mean, yeah. For what they cost, considering just about all of them are in precious metal, very reasonable stuff. Okay, so I mentioned that there's another Zenith that interested me, and somehow Armand found it in a search before I even mentioned it. But in the early 2000s, as Zenith watches were getting bigger and more complicated, the chronomasters of the 90s had not yet run their course. Now, the chronomasters, which came out originally back in 1994, they feature fluted lugs, fluted bezels, round cases, often triple calendars with moon phases too. They were generally complications. Well, because Abel in the 90s and the 80s was already using a Dubois-Dupraz perpetual calendar module on the El Primero base, Zenith got the idea to do the same thing. And so they created what was effectively their version, mechanically identical to the Abel, but with a chronomaster case and dials. They hitched the El Primero base to a Dubois-Dupraz perpetual calendar moon phase complication, and then they gave it a chronometer certification. So this was caliber 4003, 45 millimeters, white gold, chronometer certified, perpetual calendar, moon phase, El Primero. And again, just like that original Chronomaster XXT Open, this was just barely wearable by me, but it seems like it has such grandeur and dial symmetry in cruciform fashion, and the power of that white metal case with the black dial. And I love calendars. A mechanical perpetual calendar feels almost like magic. And that is still how I look at those. Every time I correct the calendar on one of my standard watches, I'm like, it would be really cool if the watch could do this and surprise me in the morning. It'd be really cool if I could stay up till midnight on, February 28th, the evening of, to see perpetual calendar day as everything turns. And it's just the coolest complication. It's not strictly necessary in the era of phones, but neither are watches. So for me, just doubling down on unnecessary mechanical calendar and time functions takes me closer to the root of why I love mechanical horology. It's that all this is being done with springs and levers and wheels, and that's the magic. So I love this watch.
This caught my eye as I was scrolling through the XXT Google image search, and I love that it is a full 3-register chrono. It's a full perpetual, and there's something about there's a 12 o'clock dial which has the full month scale for all 4 years, which I'm assuming is directly driven by the 48 wheel in this.
Yeah, the thing is, this is probably the worst way to portray a month in a leap year, and it's the one thing I don't like about this watch. It's easy enough to tell when you're in the leap year, but it's difficult to tell what the exact month is.
I agree with that. I like the full layout, actually. I'll stand on the other side of the line on that one. There's something that is, I don't know, it feels a little bit more pure to me, showing everything all at once, and just that direct connection to what makes it a perpetual calendar. Perhaps I'm romanticizing the part itself a little bit too much, but there's something that strikes a chord with me on that. The one critique I will give this is I can look at this dial and know that the movement is slightly too small for the case.
Oh, yeah. Like, seriously, this has an enormous disparity, not just between movement, because the El Primero is decently large, but module. The module is much too small for the case. And you see all those Abel 1911 chronographs with the perpetual calendar, and they're 40 millimeters or less, and they use the same module and the same base. So, yeah, that was a problem with all of the Chronomaster XXTs. Anything above 42 millimeters with an El Primero, with the traditional El Primero, looks badly proportioned. And they didn't do a great job of hiding it the way like the Patek 5070 does with multiple concentric scales. They leaned pretty heavily on a triple Gadroon bezel, but then basically threw in the towel on the dial. They're like, look, we're not going to fight it. We're just going to make it nicely balanced, but it's going to be undersized. And it is.
The bezel is definitely doing some heavy lifting, and I think if you, again, to your point, if it was 42 millimeters, it would be perfectly proportioned.
You know, the crazy thing is I led with two 45 millimeter watches. That's not even close to the biggest Zenith today, but I digress. Take us on a continuing journey of Omega and where we go from here.
All right. So I couldn't say Omega without mentioning a Speedmaster. Now, I like Speedmasters a lot. I am in the point of my thought process with collecting where my initial thought is if you're going to get a Speedmaster, get a weird one. So naturally, I go for the Mark II. Kind of a bell-shaped case, to use that phrase again, and specifically the Mark II racing dial. And the racing dial is denoted by a kind of a pale gray note with accents of orange, red, and yellow in the seconds tract. And you do kind of have this checkerboard seconds tract with a floating tachometer scale, which is just so cool in person. The tachometer scale is, I think, directly attached to underneath of the crystal. So it floats just kind of above the rest of the dial. And it just screams like a late 70s or a late 60s to early 70s, I suppose, aesthetic in general. And this is the Speedmaster. This is the steel Speedmaster that I would wear.
That's a cool piece. What do you think about the revival of it, the automatic winding revival of it? Do you like it?
So, yes and no. I think the cases are slightly too big. I think the date at 6 o'clock, while symmetrical, does hurt it a little bit. I'm not the biggest date guy on sports watches, depending. I understand the need for it. I'm wearing a date sports watch now, but on a chronograph, there's something that takes away from it. So I definitely go with the vintage version, personally.
Yeah, a very, very cool piece, and one that's got a lot of color. And you can usually tell because a well-kept version or one that's been sparsely used will have both very vivid dial colors and very sharp case definition. It tends to be that the overpolished watch also has the overexposed dial, and the overexposed dial also has the overpolished case. So the ideal here is to find one that's sat in a drawer since 1969 and then just send it to a vintage specialist for a movement service. You want it to be as raw and original as possible because there's a lot of sexiness in the satination of that bezel, which is done radially with a lapping machine, and also the really squared off lug profiles of that tonneau case. Tonneau cases don't have a lot of definition. This one does, but it's at the ends. It's on either end.
To your point about refinishing, this is a case that you can look at and see very quickly true condition due to the specificity of the shape, due to the specificity of the finish and the bevels. And the tonneau shape is purely tonneau, but it suggests round due to the shape of the crystal and the dial itself. It really does have to compare it to something modern, really does have an RM tonneau shape to it, as well as curvature of the case itself, which is interesting.
Yeah, I like that RM comparison, particularly with the use of the color and the sporting complication and sort. Even if it wasn't explicitly marketed as a motorsports watch, it is known as the Speedmaster Racing for a reason. So could this have been an inspiration for what RM started doing when he began making watches in earnest in 2001? There's nothing entirely new under the sun in the watch industry. I could very easily see this as being an influence, if not directly, at least spiritually. A really cool piece, and probably a great example of a Speedmaster you can own that is not just choked with moon lore and space lore. This is one for those who would have wheels rather than wings.
Well said.
And, you still get the Moonwatch caliber, which is fun.
What is next on your list?
So I mentioned that I had a huge watch on my list, and I didn't want every watch on my list to be some sort of El Primero derivative. So I thought I would highlight the fact that back in 2012, when Zenith rebooted its pilot's watches, it brought out the crazy Zenith Pilot Montre d'Aéronef Type 20, I should say, the Type 20. And This is a watch built around a chronometer movement designed for pocket watches, desk clocks, aviation instruments. Calibre 5011K, an utterly enormous movement, was housed in a series of limited edition pilot's watches that were 57.5 millimeters in diameter. And the idea was, in the spirit of the 1930s Zenith Type 20 aviator watch, they took the 5011Ks that were built in the middle of the 20th century, and it was a pocket watch caliber and was a chronometry trials champion in the 60s and 70s. And it was really, 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 really big. The movement is 50 millimeters in diameter.
It is massive. Looking at photos of this in hands are, this is incredible. I've seen one of these in person. An old client of mine has one of these, as well as used to have a great Zenith collection. So this is one that, my gosh, it's insane in the metal.
Yeah, it was made 250 pieces in titanium. They also made a few in precious metal, which are just clinically bonkers. But they went all the way. They finished the movement. They regulated it. They had it COSC certified. 48-hour power reserve, COSC chronometer. You've got a fascinating duplex adjustment mechanism, a gorgeous overcoil hairspring, double solarized ratchet wheel, solarized crown wheel, and crown wheel core. Just a beautiful example of traditional watchmaking. And yes, 57.5 millimeters, I probably couldn't wear this, but it's an objet d'art. This is not something you buy because you're going to casually wear it to a wedding or a dinner or expect not to be noticed. This is the kind of thing you actually put on your wrist when you're going to be among watch people. And it's going to look too big. Even, look, I don't care if you're Arnold Schwarzenegger, I don't care if you're Sly Stallone, you could have that diesel wrist, it's still too big. And I've got a review of this watch online where you could see that it's more suited to a leg than an arm. So to me, this harks back to Zenith's history as a pilot's watch manufacturer, but more intriguingly, as a serial champion of observatory trials, with movements as small as the 135 and as large as the 5011K. And if I couldn't find one of these, I would love to own one of the Thomas Engel Breguets. They were Breguet tribute watches made by the German chemist and watchmaker Thomas Engel, and some of them even included tourbillon regulators, but they were built on the 5011Ks. And they only made like 5,000 to 5,500 5011Ks, and they found their way into clocks and pocket watches. They found their way into the Engel Breguets, marine chronometers. The 5011K found its way into the series of Type 20 pilots' watches. So they're scattered to the four corners of the earth, but the most elite are the ones modified by Thomas Engel to become Breguet-style tourbillon pocket watches, and these are sometimes known as the Engel Breguets, but they're built on Zenith 5011K movements. So as much as I love this Type 20 pilot, there's an even more exotic version of this floating around. If you can find one of those, they don't show up too often.
You know, the Type 20 and the pilot collection in Zenith is really interesting. I think the piece you outlined kind of is the bullet point in that collection, and I don't think it's a well-known bullet point, because you have annual calendar pilots, you have 40 millimeter pilots, you have 48 millimeter Rolling Stone GMTs on bun straps, you have a wide selection of the Zenith pilot, which has always been a strange line to me due to really not having an outrageous feel like it's connected to history, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the history is a little bit too distant. I think if we're talking about Louis Blériot in the 1910s, first of all, I never understood the use of nostalgia to describe some of these older style watches, things that are vintage reedition or vintage tribute, because they tend to be marketed to people who are Gen X or millennial. And I think the bare minimum requirement for nostalgia is that you're revisiting something from your own memories. Whereas things that happened when framers of the Constitution were, still relatively speaking current events, and women couldn't vote, and World War I hadn't broken out. Like, this was a different time. Like, Civil War veterans in 1909 were still a big political lobby. So this isn't nostalgia. I think maybe it's astroturf to nostalgia. And I can understand why you wouldn't connect with the Zenith, because really no living person has memory of a time when Zenith was a professional supplier of pilots' watches. We've got these modern revivals, but considering Zenith pretty much petered out as an aviation supplier in the late 30s, anyone who can remember flying a plane back then, I mean, if you want to text us, that I would love to know what it's like to live to be 110, 120 years old. Like, that's incredible. That's a new experience. We've never kind of broached that on this channel. So this is a false nostalgia, and I can see why you don't connect with it. I connect with it solely because the watchmaking is so interesting. I couldn't care less what vessel that movement is in. They could put it in a box, and I would love it. So where do we go from here?
All right. So I have, you know what? I have a modern Speedmaster to throw in the mix. I had to pick something gold on a bracelet because at the end of the day, I'm still me, and I do like gold things on bracelets. So I decided to go for the modern Moonshine Gold Anniversary Series Speedmaster, specifically the champagne dial, the maroon bezel, and the dark onyx markers. I think this is a great representation of the brand at large, and why not gild it? There's something about the Moonshine Gold that I think is it's a beautiful color. It's very rich. It's very bright. It's great in person. It's very yellow, and it's a really, really faithful adaptation of a very classic gold Speedmaster.
Yeah, I think that one we're talking about is the modern recreation of the first Speedmaster limited edition, which was built as a commemorative for the moon mission, and most famously, one of them was gifted to Richard Nixon but declined as he could not accept so high value a gift, which might have been the only decent thing Nixon ever did.
I think the Supreme Court recently made that so they could accept that now, didn't they?
That's true. As long as you accept it in the Oval Office, you can now accept any gift you want in your official capacity as president. So if you want these watches, you might want to start running. Get on a ticket someplace.
I'm thinking about it.
All right.
You know, I was going back and forth because I wanted to pick an Alaska project, actually, for this slot specifically, but I like the ability to wear a watch and really not worry about it. And I think I would baby an Alaska project. I think despite not needing to, I think I would know the collectability of it and it would affect my wearing experience overall.
Yeah, which Alaska did you choose ultimately?
Just the standard, the white dial, I guess it's the first gen with the rocket-shaped hands and the aluminum, the aluminum thermopod for it.
You know, the Alaskas are interesting because they vary so much. And yeah, we're talking about I believe we're talking about Project Alaska 2, I think we're talking about Project Alaska 2. And it is the white dial. It's got the lunar lander style sort of, not quite hourglass, but maybe half hourglass shaped hands. And it has the aluminum thermo shield that includes through fittings for the chronograph. And the idea here is that it can withstand very high temperatures and also very low temperatures, both of which you encounter in space. And it's like a clamshell that goes around the outside of the watch. So really cool piece. I think probably even more challenging to wear than the 57mm Zenith when it is all of a piece. But a really nice watch, and one that can shift gears. If you want to go from mild to wild, boy, is that the way to do it. But this is one of those watches where I cannot overemphasize, if we're talking not about the original Alaska 2 prototypes from the 70s, but the modern recreation of it, you really need to get the full boxed set.
Definitely. You know, looking at the handset, they're kind of SR-71 adjacent.
Yeah, I think that's
really
an interesting one. It's got like that sort of streamlined delta wing mass rearward type of look. If you think of the SR-71 as like a big black lawn dart, this definitely has that that profile. Yeah, that, or if you can visualize like an F-106 delta dart, looks like that too. Also a cool watch, just because the legend and lore of things that never made it sometimes can be more exciting than the ones that did. The fact that this never got past like a low volume series prototype stage in the 70s probably makes it more alluring today. But a cool piece. And yeah, if you really want to make this thing look nutty, wear it with the shield and the Velcro strap.
What is next on your hit list?
Well, back in 2022, I mentioned that I didn't want this to be all El Primeros all the time. Zenith pulled out its legendary caliber 135, regulated by historical celebrity watchmakers at the manufacturer in the middle of the 20th century, and they had a number of these new old stock movements. And Atelier Voutilainen was allowed to go through them, finish them, prepare them for casing, and a 38 millimeter platinum Voutilainen dialed 10-piece limited edition called the Observatoire Calibre 135 was made available. And in my opinion, this was by far the coolest application of a new old stock movement I've ever seen. The Zenith Calibre 135 Observatoire, making sort of a fusion of the old Zenith Observatory Trials wristwatch movement and the Observatoire design that made Kari Voutilainen famous as an independent watchmaker. And so, yeah, 38 millimeters platinum, black guilloche Voutilainen dial in sterling silver, and a movement that was improved by Voutilainen, but still bearing some of the historic regulation of those who actually tuned them in period when they were made. Now, I'm not sure you can take a movement apart, service it, oil it, adjust it, and put it back together with original 60-year-old, 70-year-old regulation intact, but at least some features of the original adjustment were preserved for the final 10 pieces that were delivered, and just a really cool watch. The ultimate observatory chronometer grade dress watch, and the fact that it also has the Kari Voutilainen connection makes it even more alluring.
What a pull! That is that's an outrageous piece. I've seen this piece in passing. I don't know that I was aware of the Voutilainen connection, to be honest with you. The movement's outrageous. It's also gorgeous to look at. So this is a type of watch that, ignoring size, could have been made at almost any time.
Yeah, this is a watch that still looks good today, and I think if it were available in the 90s or the 80s, people would have applauded and nodded yes, and I think here we are, 40 years later, and this would still be considered perfect. 38 might have been a bit big for a dress watch in the 80s, but no one would have objected to the style or the proportions, the details, and nothing about that design will look any less fetching 40 years from now. Good luck getting one, though. I mean, it's not an easy watch to find, and in my opinion, this is more desirable even than the original Observatoire or a 28, and, those were series production Voutilainen watches. This is probably scarcer than most versions of those. So with the Zenith connection, I'm a Zenith guy, so that's the one I would want. If I could get a Voutilainen Zenith hybrid, I would take that over the straight Voutilainen play any day of the week.
Pairing the rarity and in the nature of the limited edition, as well as the shockingly prohibitive nature of the price that it originally was. Which
Voutilainen pricing plus.
Voutilainen pricing plus on a Zenith, and that is really outrageous. I was just seeing that the original retail was 132,900 Swiss francs.
Yeah, and with 10 made, I think you could say two things. One, it's a lot of money. Two, your investment is secure. I don't think that will ever be worth less than you pay for it.
I think this is a watch that ends up in somebody's collection and never leaves. Never, ever leaves until the person dies, until their next of kin sell it at auction.
Yeah, you'll see it auctioned as part of a celebrated collection from some Hong Kong baron who is famous for collecting only the best and never selling in his lifetime. It'll be some sort of apex collector, like one of those guys who's famous for being a collector. And I just think that it'll come up as part of a collection. No one's ever going to offer this as a onesie at an auction or throw it up on eBay. That's a really cool piece.
That is.
And again, not an El Primero. There's so much more to Zenith than the El Primero. The El Primero, lurches to life in 1969. Zenith's been around since 1865. But let's continue with Omega, which as the general watch company was actually around even longer than that.
Absolutely. So I admittedly went with a basic final pick, and I couldn't have a Omega list without a Seamaster in there, and I wanted to go with the No Time to Die. I think this is probably my second favorite Bond Seamaster. I'm a big Bond fan myself, but I love the titanium case. I love the kind of deep black espresso dial matching with bezel, with the light light faux patina, which has grown on me a lot. I love the overall feel of the watch, and it has a solid case back, and I am a sucker for that. There's something about the kind of the Milanese bracelet, the mesh bracelet, that's just fun to wear, extremely comfortable. The lightweight nature of the titanium makes the watch extremely wearable. It is a sports watch. It looks great on the NATO. It looks great on the straight end link bracelet. If I were to give it a critique, I do think a standard bracelet would be a really nice option to have, but I like it as is. I think it's kind of, again, to use the phrase, a perfect Seamaster.
Yeah, really neat piece. It'll hold up well. I'm not going to pass judgment on whether Daniel Craig was or wasn't the best Bond. I'm not going to pass judgment on whether or not No Time to Die should have ended the way it did.
Oh.
But I'm just going to say that it's a nice watch. It's very cool. I think it stands on its own. It doesn't draw too heavily on either the Bond link or nostalgia. It's just a really good-looking version, maybe the best-looking version of the current generation of Diver 300 meter. I think it's all subdued. It's got a lovely color scheme, whether you like Fotina or not. It works strictly as color accents. It's got a lovely straight lug kind of mesh bracelet that looks very period 1960s. It pays tribute not just to the whole Bond pseudo service kind of connection, but actual British military watches that were ordered in the 1960s. And so that connection is a very real one. And this might be the best version of the Diver 300 meter to own aesthetically. It's got a bubble sapphire that looks like a vintage plexi. It's got a fantastically loomed bezel. It's all subdued anti-glare. And if I do say so, it's the best Panerai ever made.
This is a bit of a potential sacrilege opinion on the Diver 300, but my runner-up to this was the 41 millimeter ceramic bezel, no wave dial that was from the early 20-aughts, before the third generation of the Diver 300 that became 42 millimeter that had the laser etch dial.
Oh, yeah. So we're talking about the one made from 2012 to 2017, I think.
Yep, exactly.
With the glossy lacquer dial, no Omega Wave, 41 millimeter case, and the last, the 2500s. That's a good-looking watch. I'm not going to lie. That is a good-looking watch. Not everyone likes the Omega Wave. A lot of people felt when it came out in the 90s, it was screaming for attention, which it probably was. A texture dial isn't always necessary if you've got a strong brand, and I think the idea of having some sort of embossed pattern made it feel a little bit more like a Tag Heuer than an Omega at the time, and I think it's only with time that we've warmed up to it, and that is nostalgia, because the people who have warmed up to it were alive in the 90s.
It is, it's the watch that... my Bond growing up was Brosnan, so it's the watch that he had on his wrist. So, it feels weird to not care for the wave dial, but that's ultimately why I went with the No Time to Die, because, again, no waves on the dial.
I love the wave dial, because back in the 90s, I thought that was the coolest dive watch on the planet. And so for me, that is genuine nostalgia. It's something I remember from my childhood, from a period when I thought watches were cool, but I couldn't afford them. And what was considered almost distasteful at the time, like a wave embossed dial with printed indices. How cheap can you get? Now, you think of the Diver 300 meter, without it, it looks wrong. And it's one of the things that sets this No Time to Die apart, that it doesn't actually indulge in that kind of nostalgic 90s whimsy. It's not the Radwood of watches. It's comfortable being something a little bit more contemporary and referring to a period that, frankly, very few people in the watch hobby can remember directly. If you were like 40 years old collecting watches in the 60s, God bless, man. I know you're closer to the end than the beginning, but that's not a nostalgia you see too often among people going into watch boutiques and buying new hardware. All right, so where do I go from here? So I've run out of slots. So I thought about going with the 1990s 39.5 millimeter steel Zenith Mango El Primero diving chronograph, which, according to the Bible of modern era Zenith, and by that I mean like 70s to present, Manfred Rossler said about 470 of these were made. Think of a diving chronograph with screw downs, 100-meter water resistance, and then just day glow mango lacquered dial. Think the papaya orange on a McLaren, and you're not far off. El Primero powered, super cool, perfectly sized, and probably the slickest looking 90s El Primero. A lot of people like the rainbows, and I love the rainbows, and I like the flyback, and I particularly the caliber 405 with the actual rainbow accents, which was made to a military contract and very cool. I prefer the mango. The mango is less common. The mango has more allure to me. I am not necessarily an aviation fan. I like the idea of something that's a seafaring chronograph, especially one that's got what seems almost like a safety orange dial. Like this almost looks like it's a marker to avoid a navigation hazard. But what it really is an opportunity to create a higher contrast dial base underwater. That's why it was made this way. It was made to preserve visibility in an era when tritium almost assured that you'd have very little residual lume once you got underwater, because tritium is self-activating, but it's also very faint. So the mango is a way of getting around that. But I'm not picking the mango, and I'm not picking the rainbow. By the way, the mango was part of the rainbow series, but the seagoing, not the airgoing rainbow series. I'm also not going to pick the 2009 El Primero Retropont Big Date, because I love that watch. And a lot of people don't realize that there was a split-second chronometer Big Date El Primero in 2009, but there was. It's another big Zenith, 44 millimeters, but that's not the one I'm going to pick. I'm going to go with something that is an El Primero in the most abstract sense possible, and this is the Academy Georges Favre that came out in 2015. So that was a big anniversary for Zenith, 150 years, and part of the anniversary collection was this 45 millimeter, 150 piece limited edition rose gold fusee with an El Primero escapement. So fusee and chain constant force device, and no chronograph, power reserve indicator, and the fusee and chain open on the dial side, and beautifully decorated. Everything about this watch is beautiful. This is Zenith pulling at the artisanal heartstrings with a watch that is beautifully detailed in a way that most of its production is not. Most Zenith watches are finished along the lines of what you'll see at Jaeger-LeCoultre, IWC, Glasuta Original, most Audemars Piguets. That is to say, competent and attractive, but mostly mechanical. This was a truly hand-decorated watch, and they put all of the action on the dial side. The fusee, the chain, the differential system, the stopworks, beautiful beyond words, and a movement only ever used in this model. There were other fusee and chain Zeniths, just a handful in the middle of the 2010s. They were based on this, but they were not exactly this model. And to top it all off, it was a certified chronometer. This was Zenith's artisanal manufacture best. And again, a big Zenith, 45 millimeters, but something I would proudly wear on my wrist. What a machine. And what a memory. I've never forgotten the first day I saw it. It's as magical to me now, even in the mind's eye, as it was then.
There is something about constant force. There's something about a chain fusee that is just outrageous. When you count out the individual parts, when you look at it in principle, when you see the tension, when you see it spooling and unspooling, it is romantic. It is outrageous. And cool pick, really great pull. And true realm of the extraordinary complication.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways to do a constant force system, but with the fusee and chain, you have the oldest and the most visually spectacular. You look at a remontoir and an FP Journe watch, and you're like, that's it. It works, but it's not visually awe-inspiring. This is awe-inspiring. This has depth. It has color. It has texture. It has tone. It's a throwback to a period, frankly, before Swiss lever escapements, because back when we had, verge escapements and later cylinder escapements, they weren't as efficient as the Swiss lever, which, of course, is British, but we're just going to call it the Swiss lever. But my point is that the fusee and chain largely ceased to be necessary with the advent of lever escapements, and so to bring it back is a wonderful anachronism. It reminds us of why we love mechanical watchmaking, not because we're pursuing the most possible accuracy in a time-telling device. That would be some sort of astronomic measurement or an atomic clock. No, we're trying to find a good timekeeper that takes the machine and almost turns it inside out so we can enjoy it. We're all about springs, levers, wheels, horns. All of that is what makes a mechanical watch magical. And going back to the fusee just doubles or triples down on that. The fact that this is being done with hundreds of little pieces and a bicycle chain the size of a piece of thread, that's the magic of it. So I love this watch. That would be in my collection of 5.
Really, really awesome pick.
Okay, guys, if you're out there listening to us, this is an interactive experience. We didn't do a whole lot of Q&A or viewer questions or listener questions today, but we're very open to them. So whether you have one question, several, or an entire show topic to suggest, reach out to us at podcasts@the1916company.com. Armand, where can they find you online?
You can find me on Instagram at It's Me Armand, or email armand@the1916